Okay, hello, and welcome to At Home with the Zen Gateway for today, which is Tuesday, the 2nd of June. So we are well into summer, I suppose, early summer now. And there we go. I'm just waiting. Oh, Linda's joined. Lovely. Okay, I'm just going to give it a minute before we get going. Just to say, whilst we're waiting, and if you're watching on the record back, just to let you know that Master Sessan is the master who we will be dealing with today, or whom we will be hearing from today. And if you remember, we actually had Master Sessan last week as well. So this is another extract from Wisdom of the Zen Masters by Irmgard Schlegel with Master Sessan, and people are coming through. Lovely. So that's Olwyn, Stephen, Roberta, Jackie, lovely, Martina, Maggie, fantastic, excellent. Anders, Dushitsa, hello, Jackie. Hello, good morning, Jackie. All right. Okay. So I think we will kick off therefore. Okay. So Master Sessan said, in our daily life, we should remember three things: joining the palms as in prayer, bowing as in worship, and charity. Joining the palms is the best posture for bringing the body and mind into a state of unity. The bow means honor and respect for others. Charity is the basis of peace in society. If we practice them, it is certain that we shall in turn receive. Again, there is a phrase most important for daily life. For the ideal, seek the high. For the practice, honor the low. It is an old Zen saying. His will treads the head of Vairocana. His practice is to prostrate himself at the feet of a child. It should be pondered deeply. The ideal must be as high and noble as possible, namely a consciousness which would set its shoe on the head of the truth body of Vairocana Buddha. But the practice must honor the lowly. In humility, he puts himself among the meanest. So here we go. Right. So yes. So there's quite a lot here, actually. I'm not sure we will necessarily get through the whole thing, but we'll see how we go. So the first thing was that in our daily life, he says, we should remember three things: joining the palms as in prayer, bowing as in worship, and charity. And starting with that phrase in daily life, because in Zen practice, we talk about a daily life practice, which is sometimes referred to as mindfulness, though for various reasons that's a problematic term, i.e. our minds are already too full and we're not sort of necessarily living in the present. And this is really something that is important for us to be addressed. Generally, I think as a society, we're very heady. We like to think our way through things a lot. And that thinking tends to take us back, tends to take us out of the situation. And what I mean by that is we're all, I'm sure, very familiar with the sort of inner sports commentator that we all have, who is, commenting and judging and evaluating everything that we're doing. So we can be walking down the streets, on our sort of constitutional walk, nice sunny day, and we're thinking, oh, it's a lovely day and the trees are out, and gosh, that garden's a real mess, isn't it? And they really should paint the outside of that house, and those windows are disgusting. And it's like, well, maybe we're not quite as uncharitable as that, but you know what I mean. There's a lot of evaluation going on, and not just with other people, with ourselves too. We're often very concerned about my performance and my progress, and whether I'm good enough, or whether this is too good for me or not good enough for me, or whatever. As Gary said recently, he quoted from the Pali Canon, where the Buddha talked about what were called the three conceits: better than, equal than, worse than. I am better than you, I'm the same as you, I'm worse than you. And each of those has, if we grasp at it, each of those can become problematical. I won't go into the whole thing, but just the Buddha obviously said it, and so therefore we should take note and ponder it deeply. So yes, so when we talk about daily life practice, we're talking about the practice of meditation really in daily life. And, the practice of meditation brings us back to the here and now. And as I've said on several occasions, the way we come back to the here and now, the easiest way to come back to the here and now is coming back into the body, because the body is always in the present. My thoughts can be, sort of reminiscing about the past. It can be worrying about the future, but the body is always in the here and now. It's always back in the present, so we can come back to it. I mean, the easiest way, we can by looking, by giving ourselves into the listening, by simply opening up to the spaciousness of the body, to the posture of the body as it is right now. If we're sitting sort of slumped over like this, quite like a sack of potatoes, it might mean that actually the life has gone out of the body. If we just sit up and open ourselves up a little bit like this, it actually feels different. It changes the way we feel on the inside. And this is something that we learn through practice. I mean, we all know about body language. We know that the heart expresses itself through the forms of the body. So if I eat something and it doesn't taste very nice, it sort of comes. And even if I'm being polite, there's a sort of isn't there? It's called a micro expression. People like Darren Brown earn a lot of money learning to read that sort of thing. And in fact, we all do it anyway. We can all read body language. But the thing is, it works the other way around as well. And that is that, if we're feeling sort of, oh, I can't be bothered, oh, I should go and do this, but I really can't be bothered, and we're sort of, giving that out, that's what the body shape, the posture looks like. Without having to change our mind, without having to fight one thought with another one, you know how it goes. Oh, you should be doing that. You should go and do the washing up, but I really don't feel like it. I can't be bothered. Shut up. Yeah, you should go and do it. Rather than sort of get involved in this sort of inner split where we're arguing with ourselves, we can just lift ourselves up. We can just open up like this and just take a moment, and suddenly we can find that split has been healed, and before we realize it, we can be moving. This is what the sixth patriarch meant when he said, before thinking of good and bad. Then he says, what is the true face, or what is the true nature? But that first part, before thinking of good and bad, is really good. That good and bad, I should, no, I shouldn't, I can't be bothered, or whatever. How we label those. As soon as we fall into that sort of binary split, that's the problem. So coming out of it means coming back into the present moment in the body. And so this is a good way to think about this first one when he says joining the palms as in prayer. Interestingly, because he says later on, he says, where's it said? Okay. Joining the palms is the best posture for bringing the body and mind into a state of unity. Okay, so that state of unity is called Samadhi in Sanskrit, and the term Sam in the Samadhi means to join together, particularly to join together two things that have come apart, to bring them back together, bring them back into harmony. So this is what daily life practice is essentially. When I give myself wholeheartedly back into what at this moment is being done, then that unity appears for as long as I'm giving myself away. And then there's a flowing with it. And it's interesting because this Samadhi actually in Zen is often referred to as Samadhi power. So it's actually a skill, it's a practice, it's a strength that's developed through meditation, through the practice of daily life practice, stroke mindfulness. Sokyam, we've had Sokyam before. So he was a Japanese priest who went to America and taught in New York in the 1930s. Because he was also an artist. And when he was at art school, he said that it was his art teacher who taught him Samadhi. And he said that, when it came time to sort of paint the waves on the ocean, he said, don't just paint the waves on the ocean, go down to the ocean and look at it, spend the whole day with the ocean, become the ocean. There's the Samadhi, the becoming. And this is what he did. He said the whole class took him at his word, and they went down to this place south of Tokyo called 999 Mile Beach, I think, or 99 Mile Beach, and they just watched the rollers coming in off the Pacific, and then they went back, and he said by the time we got back to the studio and we picked up the paintbrushes, the waves were painting the waves, and that's how it should be. I remember Soko Morinaga saying, that when he speaks to the people, he says he becomes the person. When he speaks to the layman, he becomes the layman. When he speaks to the laywoman, he becomes the laywoman. He said that's how we communicate. That is how we really are present with, the other. The other person is no longer other. As Ramana Mahesh said, when asked, when the self is realized, what about others? He said, when the self is truly realized, because the self is all encompassing, there are no others. There's that real oneness. But it's interesting here as well. He says joining the palms as in prayer, and it's interesting because prayer is not a practice that's often associated with Zen practitioners. Yet actually, if you go to native Buddhist countries, including Japan, including Zen temples, people pray all the time. They pray to Buddha and they pray to bodhisattvas in the way that, my granny used to pray to Jesus, Mary, and all the saints. And, they ask them for things, please, Manjushri, help my son pass his O-levels, that sort of thing, because he's the bodhisattva of wisdom, obviously. Or if you're going on a journey, you go to Jizo and light some incense and say, please give us a safe passage there and back, etc., because he's the bodhisattva for travelers and so on. So this is something that's quite normal, and it's interesting because in the West it's something that's sort of overlooked a little bit. It's like, prayer, it's a little bit superstitious, and people coming into Buddhism, not all, this is a vast generalization, but a little bit. Well, I always remember there was a Agatha Christie in one of her stories of Miss Marple, her super sleuth, Miss Marple, she says, yes, well, she says, the one thing you have to understand about the English is that they don't like their religion too spiritual, which I always remember. I thought that was a really good line. And it's very true. We find it a little bit, a little bit eccentric. I think we find it a little bit odd and uncomfortable. But actually, prayer's really important. Whatever you believe, I would argue. I mean, and if you're a Buddhist practitioner, at least you have faith in the Buddha nature. Whatever you conceive that to be, and hey, we all conceive it to be something. The Buddha nature very clearly is something that's transcendent. So it's something that is unknowable, because that's why the Buddha continued sitting under the Bodhi tree after his enlightenment, and didn't just get up and start teaching. It is fundamentally unknowable. It's a mystery. And so, we address a mystery, something greater than ourselves, with our hands like this, in an act of reverence. And that's really important, because a mystery is unknowable. So approaching a mystery saying, oh, well, I know what it is, or I don't pray because, it's not something that I do. Prayer isn't about you or me. It's about the mystery. And that's probably the best way that I can really put it. I don't want to over-conceptualize that. I'm just saying prayer as something, there's something in the attitude of prayer that actually is very good for people practicing Zazen, particularly those people who practice Zazen who think it's all about them and my well-being and making me a better person and, making the world a better place or whatever. That's all from the side of ego at the end of the day. Prayer creates space for mystery. And, a religion is about spirit. And when I talk about spirit, I'm not talking about some wishy-washy, vague metaphysical notion. I'm talking about something really concrete that is experienced. And prayer is definitely one way of doing it, and Zazen is definitely another way of doing it. Those who've practiced for a while will know that. So joining the hands as in prayer. So that real bringing together of body and mind, and that living in that harmony that exists in every situation, becoming part of that harmony, not separate from it, not evaluating and judging it, but really living it. Then the second one was bowing as in worship. And that bowing, he says, means honor and respect for others. And again, there's this bringing oneself down. There's instead of this sort of I know what this is about, this is rubbish, placing my own opinions and judgments on the back shelf. And my goodness, what a medicine that is, particularly when you consider how judgmental we can be of ourselves. I mean, we can be as cruel to ourselves as we can be to anyone else. In fact, probably even worse to be in many cases. So, there is this God Almighty complex, and I've told this story before, but so the Buddhist Society in London once a month gives what's called a Zen Sunday talk for people out of town. I used to do those for many, many years. It was great fun, really enjoyed it. It's a lovely crowd of people. And there was a sort of, retired lady who used to come, very, very sweet, really, your classic sort of little old lady, very, very sweet, very nice. And I used to love having a chat with her, and we got on well. And anyway, I gave a talk about, giving myself away and laying myself down and this sort of humility and so forth. And she came up after and she said, "Oh, yes, it makes complete sense. I absolutely get it. Yeah, totally." She said, the only problem is that I don't have enough ego to actually lay down. So what I need to do is to build my ego up, and then I can give my ego away, see, like this. I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "I always, she said, I suffer from a real sort of, low self-esteem. I always, I'm the very opposite of boasting. I always feel I can't. I always feel it's too much, that I lack the confidence, that it'll be too much for me, etc., etc. So I'm always sort of belittling myself in this way." So I said, "Well, who is the one that tells you you're no good? Who is the one that tells you lack confidence, that you lack the ability, that you can't, that it will be too much, that, oh my goodness, who is that one?" Because that's the God Almighty complex. That's the one that says, "Thou shalt not." As soon as you try and assert yourself, there's this voice that comes, "No," or this feeling that comes, "No," like this. I said, that's the God Almighty complex. That's where the ego is. That's where the eyes, and that's what needs to be laid down. And she looked at me whilst I was explaining this, and the little old lady vanished, and instead there was something really hard and cold and steely coming out of her eyes. And she said, "But I am useless." Like this, and you thought, "Whoa, you don't want to argue with that." Well, you do actually, but in another sense you don't. But that's where all the strength was. That's where all all that confidence and so forth was, in that God Almightiness. It's not good for humans to be God Almighty. When humans think they're God Almighty, well, who knows? You might become president of the United States. Anyway, we move on. That's as close to politics as I'm going to get. So the bow means honor and respect for others. Yes, it does. Because it means putting my own self, my own opinions, my own self-regard, in fact, on the back burner. People talk a lot about self-esteem. Actually, self-esteem itself can be problematical, because if I become fixated on it, if I grasp at it, if I become fixated on self-esteem, then I find myself in a lot of battles, A, that I won't necessarily win, and B, that take up a lot of time and energy and make me even more anxious. I've got a friend, those of you who know Jamie Shavdia, he's a clinical hypnotherapist and psychotherapist. And, I remember having a conversation with him, and he explained to me about this, that a lot of the sort of cognitive psychologists are actually moving away from this idea of self-esteem, because it can create more problems than it actually solves. He says, in the end, getting people to practice compassion, to let go, as it were, and to turn that attitude away from myself in all its manifestations, actually makes the self better. It heals it better. So, which is exactly the message of the Buddha. Fixating on myself, being selfish, in other words, makes us ill, and it makes the world ill as well. This is the message of the Buddha, basically. And it's not, you can agree with it or disagree with it, but the point is, go and find out, see what happens when, if you have to provide a service for somebody, and it takes you out of, always ruminating on your own problems, it actually relieves the bad mood that can accompany those things. And the good thing about it is, you actually feel better at the end of it, and it allows you then to be able to relook at the problem. Again, interesting, and it goes with this bowing as well, because Venerable Myokyoni was a big advocate of it. I remember someone coming up to her and saying, "Oh, there's this problem situation at work, and it gets me all sort of out of sorts, and I get reactive, and I just, I can't keep an even temper with it, really, and I really need to learn to do this." And she said, okay. And she didn't say, "Oh, well, do this, do that, do the other," because she knew perfectly well that the person would know what to do if they were in their sort of right mind. But the problem is, when we're in a situation that winds us up or disturbs our temperament in some way, we are not ourselves. So giving myself the best advice, it will be forgotten in the circumstances, because I'm so overwrought, in a really emotional situation. I get very overwrought. So actually what she did say, she said, well, if you can remember one thing, she said, bow. She said, go excuse yourself, go somewhere to the quiet, like to the loo, and just make 9 bows. Don't think, you're not bowing to anything, you're just bowing. Okay, and then when you come up from that 9th bow, look again at the situation. She said the situation will provide the solution itself. And it's really interesting that it comes that way around. I think all solutions have to come from me. But actually, if I'm cast into one of what are called the 6 realms on the wheel of life, like a fighting demon or a hungry ghost or a hell being or something like that, then actually I'm no longer human. The consciousness that's being experienced subjectively is no longer human. It's afflicted, to use the Buddhist term. And so that bowing, that bringing together body and mind into that unity, bringing the body, which brings us back into the present, which returns us to our true nature, but the Buddha nature, the wisdom of the Buddha nature, and the warmth of the heart as well. Then when we look with that consciousness at the situation, it tells us what we can do, or it tells us whether we can do something. And if we can't do something right at that moment, it tells us that, well, maybe later. But in the meantime, here's the strength to be able to cope with it. It's going to be uncomfortable, but hey, you've experienced discomfort before and you got through it, and you'll get through this too. And that's where the confidence comes from. It doesn't come from me, it comes from the Buddha heart. And then the third thing, I told you we were not going to get through the whole of this, that the third thing he said is charity. And Chase said charity is the basis of peace in society. And it's interesting, because I gave this talk a couple of weeks ago at a retreat to the Zen group. And I sort of said, it's interesting, a lot of people feel somewhat always found, when talking with Venerable Myokyoni, who was not a great advocate of charitable works, and she certainly wasn't an advocate of political activism and so forth, which, the two things can align, obviously, wanting to change the world, make the world a better place, etc. She had a suspicion about that impulse, not because there's something wrong with it, but because probably from her own upbringing, she had seen the devastation that can be wrought when when people go out en masse to make the world a better place, and those people are still subject to blindness and the elements of their own shadow. And you remember we talked about the shadow last time, and its dark truths. So she was Austrian, and she was in Austria during, obviously, the Nazi occupation. Well, the Anschluss, as it was, part occupation, part welcomed them in, actually. But she was very aware, obviously, of that. And the 20th century was once described as the century of idealism, because there was communism and there was Nazism, and the millions that those two ideologies, wrought, and others too, Cambodia in the 70s as well, and even in the West, we have our missions that we have, whether they were religious, whether they're to political and to democratize the world, etc. Well, you can have these debates. The point is just to raise these things, because even with the best will in the world, things can go very wrong. So, charity has always had a slight sort of with the group that I'm with. However, charity is important too, and the daily life practice, of course, it can manage, and politics has to be managed because, we live in a political world, we live in a social world, we have civic duties, we vote, and, well, I regard it as a civic duty to vote anyway, but, yeah, so these things have to be navigated. I don't think it's good enough just to sort of turn your back and say, oh, well, if they're a little bit suspect, I'm not going to have anything to do with them. I think that's not if that is a political act as well. Not doing anything is a choice, as much as doing something, and that has karmic consequences too for oneself and for others too. It's an easy world. So just say that, but the charity side of it is also important too, because I think the in the straightforward term, the charity side of it reminds us that we are in an interdependent world, physically as well as spiritually, as well, and that is important. And I think, as Sessan said, charity is the basis of peace in society. And I think, outside of this sort of idea of who should be providing charity and whether it's, part of the problem or part of the solution, I think what's at the basis of it is this idea of giving, which is the first parameter, dana. It's the giving of ourself. But it's also being of service, and I think the being of service is particularly important. If the heart is humbled, then that being of service, I think, wells up quite naturally. So those are the other thing as well about charity is that, they say charity starts at home. It's true. Charity, that idea of caritas, of giving a helping hand to things, is by the way, not just something that's limited to humans or just limited to animals and living beings either. It can be applied even to so-called inanimate things as well. I spoke again recently about people wanting to set up a meditation practice and about having a shrine at home.